Hello everyone, welcome to the 10th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we have completed 9 weeks of this course. In the first week, we have discussed historical location of the idea of development within quote. In the second week, we have discussed end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world, and the desire for development. In the third week, we have discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. In the fourth week, in the fourth, fifth and sixth weeks, we have discussed modernization theory, and in the seventh week, we have discussed critiques of modernization theory. In the eighth and ninth week, we have discussed dependency theory. And now, in terms of 2 lectures, in the 10th week, we are going to dwell upon critiques of dependency theory. When I say dependency theory, if you slightly recall, dependency theory emerged in the context of Latin American debates on underdevelopment. It emerged as a critique of modernization theory. It emerged as a convergence between 2 intellectual trends, namely Neo-Marxism on the one hand and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, popularly known as the ECLA tradition on the other. And then we have discussed dependency theory through the works of Stavenhagen's 7 erroneous theses on Latin America, Cardoso as historical structural method, Dos Santos basic prerequisites for a more solid theory of development in the context of Brazil, Sankel in the context of Chile, and Andrew Gunther Frank's capitalism and underdevelopment in Latin America. Then we have discussed how the ECLA analysis was radicalized through the works of Furtado and Sankel. There we have discussed Sankel's model of global dualism, transnational integration and national disintegration. Then we have discussed Marxist influences through the works of Cardoso and Faleto. Then we have discussed Neo-Marxist influences through the works of Dos Santos and Marini. And then we have discussed the crystallized theory of dependence through the works of André Gunther Frank's metropolis satellite model. Then we have discussed the essence of the dependency perspective through 6 structural dualist categories, namely holism versus particularism, external versus internal, economic analysis versus socio-political analysis, sectoral regional contradictions versus class contradictions, underdevelopment versus development, and voluntarism versus determinism. And in this week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to dwell upon the critiques of the dependency theory. Not simply critics, but also how dependency theory got disintegrated. Okay? And the critics of the dependency theory, if you look at this, basically the critics of the dependency theory emanated from the neoclassical economics as well as the Marxist theory of development. And then we will discuss at the crossroads the debate among the dependists, and then we will discuss how dependency theory either strengthened or got weakened in the context of Asia in general and India in particular, especially the Indian mode of production debate. The enthusiasm about the new ideas of the 1960s subsided gradually during the early 1970s. The dependency school was criticized by those who previously supported it. At the beginning, the critique was directed at isolated errors and misunderstandings in the dependency analysis, while in the general approach dependency was accepted and then was left alone for the time being, and the ensuing debate was a more or less internal dispute among various Marxists, and this controversy turned out to be of great importance to the future of the dependency school. It might, however, be interesting to see how neoclassical economists viewed the dependency school before we examine the Marxist critique. Let us see the neoclassical reaction. It would be misleading to speak of a real debate between conventional economists on the one hand and the dependency school on the other. It was more of a long poignant pause. For example, Foster Carter has provided a striking description of this by referring to the way in which Andre Gunder Frank's writings were received by the advocates of the modernization paradigm. According to Foster Carter, as well as Nov, Frank's works were reviewed in only a few of the well-known journals, and all of them took a more or less unappreciative attitude. Alec Nov, for instance, intimated that he would hardly have passed a student who had produced a paper similar in quality to that of Frank. This lack of communication and sympathy can only be explained by the fact that, as already mentioned, it was a matter of two completely different paradigms. Okay, what are those two different paradigms? I mean, modernization theory on the one hand and dependency theory on the other. The neoclassical economists did not consider the dependency school's analysis to be scientific. They claimed, often correctly, that the dependency theorists had little knowledge of neoclassical economic theory. It can of course hardly be denied that their knowledge in this particular area was often far from perfect. Some of the major dependency works opened with a critical summary of neoclassical theory in the sense that to which no self-respecting neoclassical economist would put his name, according to Semiramis. The first serious discussion by the school by a non-Marxist economist came in 1975 when Sanjay Lall tried to penetrate the dependency theory and to provide an evaluation of it based on its own assumptions. Not only was he confused by the fact that the Latin American dependency school held so many varying views about dependency, but also by the fact that the concept of dependence was used by most of those who were in some way involved in the problems of the periphery of the third world, regardless of ideological color. Lall therefore wondered if dependence really was a useful concept in the analysis of underdevelopment. In order for the term dependence to be of any use in a theory of underdevelopment, Lall required two criteria to be met. One, it must lay down certain characteristics of dependent economies which are not found in non-dependent ones. And secondly, this one, these characteristics must be shown to affect adversely the course and pattern of development of the dependent countries. To see whether the first criterion, that is, it must lay down certain characteristics of dependent economies which are not found in non-dependent economies, to see whether this first criterion had been met, Lall went through a number of aspects, both socio-political as well as economic aspects, which were characteristics of dependent countries, and examined if they were present in non-dependent countries. This is very important. This he found to be the case. I mean, the dominance of foreign capital, one of the most important aspects of dependence, is a good example. For example, Canada and Belgium are more dependent on foreign investments than are, for example, India or Pakistan. And yet, Canada and Belgium cannot be categorized as dependent economies, whereas India or Pakistan, they can be categorized as dependent countries. It was therefore, in Lall's opinion, impossible to distinguish between dependent and non-dependent countries on the basis of static criteria. This does not mean that Lall denied the existence of the characteristics used by the dependency school to describe dependent countries. Lall merely wanted to demonstrate that they were not special expressions of a dependent capitalism, but rather typical expressions of capitalist development in general. Both dominance as well as dependence exist, but they are as commonplace in the center as they are in the periphery. Lall's second criterion, that these characteristics must be shown to affect adversely the course and pattern of development of the dependent countries, the second criterion concerned the question of whether a dependency theory could be constructed in accordance with these static characteristics. He found no causal connection between the static characteristics and underdevelopment. Nevertheless, and thus no basis for a theory of Latin American underdevelopment. In Lall's opinion, one might call it a catalogue of social, economic, political and cultural factors, which however are unable to help us explain the dynamics of Latin American underdevelopment. Lall therefore pointed out that when reading the literature, you often get the impression that dependence is defined by circular reasoning. Less developed countries are poor because they are dependent and they show all the characteristics of dependence. Although there was no debate between neoclassical economists and dependency theorists on the dependency theory as such, one important aspect of the dependency theorists was however discussed, like the theory of unequal exchange by Boyer. As we have already discussed in the context of Raoul Prebisch, who had stressed that one cause of underdevelopment was exploitation through trade. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Marxists had dealt with this question as part of the theory of unequal exchange, but had never given it a high priority. Stimulated by Raoul Prebisch's analysis, the Marxists revived the question, which eventually came into its own through the works of Emmanuel. What Emmanuel did, the theory of unequal exchange deals with the mechanisms of value transfers between countries. It attempts to construct a theory of foreign trade based on the Marxian theory of value, and briefly the principle of unequal exchange is this. What is that theory of unequal exchange? Now, that is a commodity's price. The price of a commodity is being determined by the market. An exchange between two commodities is always made on the basis of these price equivalents. On the contrary, a commodity also has an objective value. In order to determine this objective value, Marx used the number of hours worked by labor as his system of reference. Since price and value have different systems of reference, they need not coincide. An exchange of commodities might therefore be unequal in terms of value despite equal commodity prices, thus causing a transfer of value. If you look at the works of Braun, Capito and Pizarro, you will find this, that the development of a theory of unequal exchange was therefore not directly linked to the Latin American dependency school, although a number of Latin Americans also worked on this question. The dependency theorists saw trade as one of the several ways in which the center exploited the periphery. They therefore considered the theory of unequal exchange only as part of the theory of underdevelopment. The reason why the neoclassical economists even bothered to criticize the theory of unequal exchange was that, apart from being important to development theoretical issues, it influenced entire neoclassical theory of trade. For example, Metcalfe and Stedman showed that the Heckscher-Ohlin conclusion about the tendency towards an international equalization of factor prices was not general, and this started a debate in economic journals in which even Paul Samuelson participated. However, the most severe critics of the theory of unequal exchange were Marxists, not neoclassical economists. and hence it is important to look at the Marxist critique of the dependency theory so far as the debate between development and underdevelopment is concerned. The Marxists remained rather passive during the initial stages of debate started by the dependency school. Thus, the dependency school's critique of Marx's universal scheme of development, as described in the manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848, for instance, could hardly be considered open to objections. Nor could objections be raised against the conclusion that the use of the concept of an Asiatic mode of production for the purpose of explaining the relative stagnation in a number of non-European countries had been unsuccessful. The silence was broken during the early 1970s, not for the purpose of belittling the efforts of the dependency school, but rather to lead it on to the right track. The critique was primarily directed at the way in which the dependency school dealt with class relations. Without a class analysis, the theory of dependence appeared as an eclectic combination of orthodox economic theory and revolutionary phrases. Frank was particularly singled out for criticism. It was from a Marxist point of view totally unsatisfactory to explain underdevelopment by the center's exploitation of the periphery's economic surplus. The transfer of the economic surplus was, of course, one important aspect of underdevelopment, but the latter must be explained by deeper underlying factors, which in turn also explain the transfer of the economic surplus. If you look at that how can this be accomplished, then the only way was to use Marx's method of historic analysis. I mean the Marx's materialist conception of history, historical materialism, structure of social relations. Okay, an analysis of the history of a given society, according to Marx, must start from the structure of social relations. Such an analysis therefore requires a study of the basic class relations in a society, and different modes of production create different class relations, and in this way, in order to explain the Marxist criticism of Frank as well as the Marxist alternative to the dependency analysis, it is necessary to examine the different views of the modes of production in the less developed countries, since they in turn implicitly contain views on the causes of underdevelopment. Okay. In this context, Lall is important, who was opposed to Frank's theory that capitalism has pervaded Latin America since the Spanish conquest, and questioned what Frank really meant by capitalism. Since no explicit definition was provided, Lall was forced to look for characteristics that, according to Frank, indicated the capitalist mode of production. Okay? That is a system of production for the market in which profit constitutes the motive of production, and this profit is realized for the benefit of someone other than the direct producer. Feudalism, on the contrary, was in Frank's opinion a closed subsistence economy. This implied that the crucial difference between capitalism and feudalism was the existence of a substantial market. Thus, Frank did not consider the free labor market as a prerequisite to the capitalist mode of production, and studied only what in Marxist terminology is called the sphere of circulation or the sphere of exchange. What Lall wrote, that only by abstracting them, I mean the production relations, can Frank arrive at a sufficiently wide notion of capitalism to include the different exploitative situations suffered by the indigenous Peruvian peasantry, or the Chilean inquilinos, the Ecuadorian hospengos, the slaves of the West Indies sugar plantations or textile workers of Manchester. Lall, on the contrary, followed Marx when he defined a mode of production what then really separated the capitalist mode of production, okay, from the pre-capitalist modes of production or pre-capitalist social formations was the fact that the worker was free to sell his or her labor, and Marx used this condition to prove the uniqueness of capitalism per se, as well as to allow a definition of capitalism as a unique mode of production. In fact, the market had been characteristic of several pre-capitalist modes of production, which proved that a definition based on the sphere of exchange was inadequate. The production sphere must be considered as well, and Lall carried the matter to an extreme by saying that Frank's definition implied that capitalism has reigned supreme since the Neolithic age. Lall went on to discuss the possibility of different modes of production coexisting. As opposed to Frank, Lall considered it likely that a given economic system might be a combination of coexisting modes of production, and within such a combination, one mode of production will assume a dominating position. In this way, Lall was able to show the coexistence of, amongst other things, slave economy and capitalism without having to neglect the dominating role played by the capitalist mode of production. Nevertheless, this should not be interpreted as an acceptance of the theory of the dualist thesis. To reaffirm the feudal character of relations of production in the agrarian sector does not necessarily involve maintaining a dualist thesis. Dualism implies that no connections exist between the modern or progressive sector on the one hand and the closed or traditional sector on the other. Yet, on the contrary, servile exploitation was accentuated and consolidated by the very tendency of entrepreneurs, presumably modern in type, to maximize profits. The apparent lack of communication between the two sectors herewith disappears. Lall's analytical objective was met by basing the definition of an economic system on the relations of production, and by viewing that economic system as a structured and diversified entity. And in this sense, Lall was then able to prove that there had been and still were feudal elements in Latin America, and most important of all, these feudal elements did not exist independently of capitalism, nor as something which would automatically disappear with the introduction of capitalism, but rather as an inherent and structured part of a larger system. The feudal mode of production was therefore not only able to survive in Latin America, but was strengthened by foreign penetration during certain periods. With these different views about the modes of production in mind, Frank and Lall, they were more eager to look at the causes of underdevelopment. For example, Frank and Lall were in agreement on the fact that a transfer of the surplus from the periphery to the center did in fact take place. Frank nevertheless believed that this surplus transfer was the true cause of underdevelopment, whereas Lall claimed that it was merely an expression of more basic relations. To answer as required to the question of what causes underdevelopment, we need therefore to answer the questions of how and why this transfer of surplus has taken place as well. In Lall's opinion, Frank has been unsuccessful in doing so mainly because of his broad definition of capitalism. How was Frank, what Lall questioned, the way Lall questioned Frank, that how was Frank to distinguish between the contradictions of 16th century capitalism on the one hand and those peculiar to the 20th century capitalism. What he said, if Coerch, Pizarro, Clive and Cecil Rhodes are all one and the same, there is no way of tracing the nature and origins of economic dependence in relation of production. If on the other hand, we cease to regard capitalism whose omnipresence frees us from all explanatory problems and try instead to trace the origins of dependence in concrete modes, to renounce all talk of a single unique contradiction, because relationships of dependence have always existed on the margins of the existence of capitalism. Thus, the difference between Frank and the Marxists concerning the causes of underdevelopment becomes more obvious when Frank claims that the root of underdevelopment is to be found in the periphery's contacts with the center, contacts marked by the periphery's role as a producer and exporter of primary products, raw materials and so on. Marxists on the contrary point out that a number of structures, a number of now developed countries have also played this role, but since their class structures were completely different, the end results were also different. The search for a satisfactory answer to this question must be based on the class structure associated with material production. There are some who claim that this question, that is whether internal conditions or external penetration was the cause of underdevelopment, is totally meaningless, and that the polarization is an obstacle to the proper understanding of the real causes of underdevelopment. How do you decide which of the heart or the stomach was basic? The question is meaningless. For example, according to Foster Carter, since both of the components are important, neither can be excluded. Nevertheless, this contribution to the debate reveals a possible misunderstanding. Marxists do not neglect the importance of external factors in the process of underdevelopment. When they claim that internal factors are most important, external factors are certainly capable of influencing the internal class structures to the extent that a change of the system is made possible. It is just that all historical analysis must be based on the process of production, that is the prevailing forces and relations of production in a society. The contradiction between the relations of production is the driving force behind the development of each class society. It also creates a class conflict, which regardless of whether the class structure is changed by internal or external factors remains the motor of history. A frequently occurring example would serve as an illustration of this point when we look at this, that the slave economy in the New World. For example, in the words of John Weeks and Elizabeth Dorr, this what they wrote, that this was a system wholly imposed or created by external force. It did not exist prior to the spread of mercantile capitalism. Indeed, the class of direct producers was forcibly created through warfare, fostered or exploited by mercantile capital in Africa, and then the captives were transported to the New World. But once the slave society was created, its further evolution was primarily determined by the class struggle internal to it between slave and master. Nor is that question meaningless, since the choice of approach depends on how causal relations are viewed. The effects of this on further analysis may be illustrated by the political and strategic aspects. There is no feudalism in Latin America according to Frank's definition of the modes of production. Therefore, Frank reaches the conclusion that the only way to break the development of underdevelopment is to break with capitalism and introduce socialism. In Marxist eyes, this theory of revolution is more of a nationalist ideology, and since it neglects class conflicts and legitimates class collaborations. That is why Phillips, for example, he wrote that socialism has become then something which is chosen for its superiority over capitalism rather than an outcome dictated by the balance of class forces and the dynamic of class struggle. The agreement, the arguments center on why it is necessary not on whether it is immediately possible, and consequently detailed analysis of the nature and focus of existing class struggles are few and far between, while analysis of the relationships between national and international capital are in abundant supply. According to the Marxist critics of the dependency school, the logical consequence of Frank's theory would be autarky rather than socialism. Locke's analysis nevertheless also showed that Marx had been too optimistic in predicting that the development of the periphery would be a mirror-like reflection of that of the center. The capitalist penetration of the periphery did not cause the disintegration of the pre-capitalist social formations. I mean, the latter on not only survived but were periodically strengthened. Thus, to blame underdevelopment on the capitalist penetration, as Frank had done, was to misunderstand the entire problem. Since the pre-capitalist elements had not disintegrated, it was rather a question of insufficient capitalist penetration. It is interesting to see that the early Marxist critique of the dependency school actually came from Latin America. For example, if you look at Locke was an Argentinian, where a more orthodox Marxist group immediately took up the challenges. Although this group is rarely mentioned, which is quite natural in view of the popularity enjoyed by the dependency school, it continued its severe critique of the dependency theorists throughout the 1970s. This is illustrated by the conference on Latin America's modes of production in Mexico City in 1974. A number of original contributions were presented, which were all critical of the dependency school. Nevertheless, when we'll look at the theoretical critique that resulted in a number of empirical studies which proved the hypothesis of the development of underdevelopment to be questionable. Bill Warren's study, for example, is presumably the best known of these. Warren found that the prospects for a successful capitalist development, which in his opinion meant industrialization, were relatively good in many underdeveloped countries, that a considerable capitalist development had already taken place in the third world, particularly since the Second World War, and that potential obstacles to this development were not to be sought among the external factors, namely imperialism, namely colonialism, right, but rather among the internal contradictions that imperialism facilitated the industrialization of the third world, and finally that the third world's dependence on the developed nations has increased, has decreased and will continue to do so, resulting in a shift of power within the capitalist world. And in this way, Warren made a frontal assault on the thesis that imperialism was standing on the way of an internal capitalist development in the periphery. He claimed that the opposite was the case. In fact, imperialism had accelerated this development by breaking down the traditional and static societies and thus paving the way for the industrial society. Warren also claimed that the rapid industrialization of the periphery after the Second World War was a result of its political independence combined with certain strategies of the world economy. What Warren wrote here, that independence has been a direct cause, not just a permissive condition of industrial advance, by giving the underdeveloped countries a degree of maneuver and initiative, which over time must inevitably come into play and which is conducive to economic advance. What has been crucial is the combination of political independence with certain objective conditions in the post Second World War phase, specifically East-West rivalries and inter-imperialist rivalries, which have been the major external influence, have linked with internal forces, especially the rise of new ruling groups and the increase in popular, often petty bourgeois mobilization. Returning to Laclau for a moment, I mean, we have already mentioned the fact that Locke's analysis was not only meant as a critique of Frank and the rest of the dependency theorists, but also as a critique of Marx's optimistic view of about the future of the backward countries. And in this context, Warren had no objection to Marx. His views on imperialism here in many respects similar to Marx's views on colonialism. Like Marx, Warren saw imperialism as a transitory stage, as a system which declines as capitalism grows. This return to the master was of course soon challenged. Nevertheless, you will find about the current trends in the theory of development. Although Frank was the one who was most criticized by the Marxists, the critique was also directed at other dependency theorists whose works were based on neo-Marxist ideas. Earlier also we have mentioned Dos Santos's attempts to abandon neo-Marxism. He criticized Frank's view that underdevelopment was a question of external exploitation. Instead, he emphasized that the Latin American development was a result of certain internal structure. Dos Santos in the context of Brazil, okay, which in turn were determined by international relations of dependence. He continued to identify the types of dependence which in turn determined the different internal structures, and emphasized the fact that not only was there a contradiction between the internal and the external structure, but that this very contradiction was the root of underdevelopment. For example, in his concrete analysis of underdevelopment, I mean financial, technological dependence and so on, Dos Santos nevertheless abandoned this view and let regional contradictions and the transfer of the economic surplus play the key roles along with the now dominant external factors. And in doing so, he returned to Frank's position and was thus immediately exposed to Marxist criticism. At this point, it might be convenient to mention the most important aspects of the Marxist critique of Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange. Of course, Marxists did not deny the existence of unequal exchange, which after all was one of the ways in which the surplus might be transferred from the periphery to the center. Their critique was aimed at, Marxists' critique was aimed at Emmanuel's analysis because it was incapable of showing that this really was so. In Emmanuel's opinion, the basic contradiction was the one between rich and poor countries. The developed countries exploited the underdeveloped ones, which implied that even the workers in the developed countries were responsible for the exploitation of the third world. To a Marxist, this opinion is absurd, this notion is absurd. Like Frank and Dos Santos, Emmanuel based his definition of classes on the sphere of circulation and was therefore also singled out for such critique. Dos Santos's difficulties in ridding himself of his neo-Marxist heritage are revealed in his definition of dependence. Like many other dependency theorists, he distinguished two types of capitalism, namely normal capitalism and dependent capitalism, of which normal capitalism was capable of achieving a self-generating growth and dependent capitalism merely of developing as a reflection of the normal capitalism, okay, or you can say developed countries. This view, according to Marxism, is nothing but a romantic notion of the true nature of capitalism, as well as a reflection of a nostalgic longing for a frustrated autonomous capitalist development. What Bernstein said, underdevelopment theory cannot have it both ways. In the field of analysis is world economy, if the center needs the periphery for modes of exploitation that offset the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, if the circuit of capital in general is realized on the international plane, then there is no capitalist formation whose development can be regionally autonomous, self-generating and self-perpetuating. Development in this sense cannot be conceptualized by its self-centered nature and lack of dependence, nor underdevelopment by its dependence and lack of autonomy. In this way, the dependency theorists who analyzed peripheral capitalism in this fashion were described by certain Marxists as narodniks, because their moral critique of capitalism was quite similar to that expressed by the original bearers of the name. For example, if you look at the development of capitalism in Russia, so far as Lenin primarily dealt with the questions about peripheral capitalism and so on, in which he discussed the effects of the links between external and internal structures on the development of backward regions. There Lenin argued that that the lack of capitalist development in Russia in reality was a result of this. Cardoso, for example, is perhaps closest to Lenin's work and the one who most consistently has tried to elaborate on the approach used by Lenin in his analysis of the capitalist development in Russia. Consequently, Cardoso never regarded the notion of dependence as a universally valid concept upon which a theory of dependency can be constructed. In the opinion of Cardoso, a theory of capitalism was already available, that is, the Marxist theory. The purpose of the notion was rather to be used in concrete analysis of how external and internal factors affect development in the periphery. Cardoso pointed out that it was incorrect mechanically to draw a dividing line between external and internal factors in such a study, and that it was instead a matter of a dialectical interplay in which the internal factors ultimately determined the concrete manifestations in the periphery of a change in the world capitalist system. Cardoso has consistently claimed that capitalist development is taking place in Latin America, although it is of a rather special kind. Furthermore, Cardoso cannot be criticized for ignoring the internal structures and the class struggle in his analysis. On the contrary, the internal structures are crucial in a development process. Cardoso has nevertheless objected to the orthodox Marxist view of classes, according to which all classes are rooted in the process of material production. Okay? To Cardoso, this view is too narrow. If the functioning of the peripheral societies is to be understood, they are, in his opinion, too complex for an analysis that follows Marx's universal scheme. The class concept must contain structural and institutional factors, races, ethnic groups, religious groups, and so on, all of which may be included in a dependence analysis, since the purpose of such an analysis is merely to study concrete situations in the less developed countries. Cardoso's view of classes has, of course, been subjected to Marxist critique. John Mayer, for example, has accused Cardoso of engaging in Marxist and Leninist phraseology. Since Cardoso does not base his definition of class on the way in which different groups are related to the area of production, he cannot be considered to be a Marxist for Mayer. However, it is difficult to deny the importance of the structural relations which Cardoso has identified, even though Marxists have been doing so for a long time. In fact, Mayer did not succeed in showing how these factors were to be incorporated into a Marxist theory. In this context, it might be interesting to look at the critique of Foster Carter's distinction between Marxism and Neo-Marxism, which we have discussed, from the vantage points of imperialism and nationalism, classes, revolution and ethics, and ecology, and so on. Okay? It's important to look at the theoretical traditions with which one associates names such as Paul Baran, Paul Suiji, and Andre Gunder Frank. It was of great significance as a source of inspiration to the dependency school. The dismissal of this distinction is of great importance to Marxists as well, who are concerned about the integrity of Marxism. Taylor accomplishes this by calling it a sociological fantasy. Taylor's main argument is that Foster Carter erroneously assumes that the space allowed to a specific problem by a certain theoretical tradition is a measure of the latter's ability to analyze the problem theoretically. Consequently, Taylor admits that Marxism as compared to Neo-Marxism has devoted relatively little attention to the conditions in the third world, but this does not imply that classical Marxism is theoretically less equipped to tackle this problem, and that it is therefore necessary to abandon fundamental Marxian concepts. In line with such critique, Taylor emphasizes the fact that concepts such as surplus, dependence, underdevelopment and so on tend to obscure important issues that might be dealt with more effectively by the traditional Marxist analysis, even if the conceptual apparatus of the latter might require some clarification. And thus, at the same time as Taylor evaluates both Marxist school on the one hand and Neo-Marxist school on the other, in the process of which he reduces Neo-Marxism to Paul Baran and Andre Gunder Frank, Taylor dismisses the idea that they should be seen as competing theoretical alternatives. And in this sense, Taylor says that Foster Carter is perhaps on his weakest ground when he argues that there do in fact exist two such unities as Marxism on the one hand and Neo-Marxism on the other. How can we possibly group together the works of Emmanuel and Charles Bettelheim, or perhaps more questioningly Jelly and Samiramin? Foster Carter's answer is quite simply that they are all concerned with analyzing the same real object, namely imperialist penetration and its effects upon an underdeveloped society. This nevertheless is really equivalent to making such a broad generalization as that the biological sciences take nature as their real object, and it does not help us at all in assessing the relative value of one problematic as against another. Supporters of law and order or the ideological corps in the Marxist camp have greeted this attack with loud cheers. Henry Bernstein, for example, claims that John Taylor's critique has totally demolished Foster Carter's celebration of Neo-Marxism. The concept is nevertheless being used sporadically, not because of its lucidity, but simply because it is needed. And Blomstorm and Hetney's use of the concept is based on this heuristic function. As if you look at Lay's deliberation on this issue, probably the most important non-Latin American contribution to the Marxist critique of the dependency school was Colin Lee's article Underdevelopment and Dependency, Critical Notes. For several years, Lee was the most prominent dependency theorist in Kenya from Africa. So, when he turned his back on the dependency school, he also repudiated the result of 10 years of his work. Lees claimed that the dependency theory was no longer applicable and that it somehow had to be transcended. There were several reasons for this. First, it was repetitive and theoretically stagnant, and secondly, it was incapable of providing a solution to as well as a formulation of certain problems, and finally, it lacked realism. Lee's more theoretical objections to the dependency theory were, first, the meaning of development is obscure. Okay. In contrast to Asia and Africa, there seem to be few original ideas in Latin America about the positive content of development. Secondly, it is unclear whether it is the underdeveloped countries or the masses in these countries that suffer from exploitation. In other words, the obvious answer is of course both the underdeveloped countries or the masses in these underdeveloped countries, they suffer from exploitation, but the emphasis of analysis has theoretical implications. Concepts like center and periphery are primitive and nothing but polemical inversions of the simplistic pairings of bourgeois development theory, traditional and modern and so on. If you say if modernization theory was charged with being ethnocentric in nature by looking at binaries, dichotomies, as it was based on racism of the biological school of evolutionary theory. Similarly, you will find that dependency theorists, they are also looking at center and periphery as binaries in the context of being traditional, in the context of being modern and so on, okay, in the context of being civilized, in the context of being barbaric and so on. Okay. But of course, dependency theorists are not racists, but they also operated on the basis of certain binaries like modernization theorists. But as modernization theorists were racists in nature, okay, the construction of modernization theory was racist in nature, the construction of dependency theory was never racist in nature. Okay. In this sense, the theory tends to be economistic, suffers from economic reductionism, okay, in the sense that social classes, the state, politics, ideology get very little attention, okay, economism, economic reductionism. The ultimate causes of underdevelopment are not identified apart from the thesis that they originate in a center. Okay. I mean, Colin Lee's article that underdevelopment and dependency critical nodes was the go ahead for the new Marxist view of development. Please note that contrary to the neo-Marxists, Marxists speak of development rather than underdevelopment, to which we will discuss when we will be discussing at the crossroads the debate among the dependists that you will find in the context of the method adopted. That is very important. I mean, the economic aspect was included only as a loosely defined structure upon which the authors had built a mainly sociological analysis. The economic factor was thus of importance only to the definition of the structural parameters. The study then went on to analyze the behavior of various social groups from a sociological point of view. Bambira, for example, claimed that the behavior of social groups and classes must be derived from their objective economic interests and from the way in which these such aspects change over time. Thus, the economic factor will appear to be static when the economic and the sociological analysis are not performed concurrently. Then we will also discuss the way in which the development of various Latin American socio-economic structures was analyzed. I mean, how Cardoso and Faleto did not provide a thorough discussion about the structural changes in Latin America from the mid 19th century onward, and they ought to have provided an analysis of how structural changes in the developed capitalist societies also led to changes in the dependent countries. Then we will also discuss the classification of countries. I mean, as a result of what we have discussed in the context of the dependists, I mean the proponents of dependency theory, Bambira felt that the author's way of classifying the countries in the study was inappropriate in the context of center and periphery. Two types of countries have been used for the historical analysis, and those which had managed to gain national control of the process of production and enclave economies. Accordingly, both Mexico and Chile were characterized as enclave economies, which in Bambira's opinion was unrealistic, and both countries actually belonged somewhere between the two prototypes. Okay, there was that's what when we say that the debate among the dependists, I mean the proponents of dependency theory, I mean at the crossroads. Okay, this is extremely important. The possibilities for a generation of domestic technology were excluded. If you look at the way the dependency theorists were also proved wrong in certain more narrowly defined areas, one of which was the effects of technological dependence, and technological dependence was generally considered to be a crucial element in the overall dependence. Among other things, the dependency theorists claimed that since those who controlled the generation of technology, that is the center, also have the capacity to control its exploitation, this would lead to the permanence of technological dependency, financial dependency, and so on, industrial dependency. The emergence of technology generation by indigenous enterprises in underdeveloped countries raised new questions concerning the role of technology imports in general and of direct investment of multinational corporations in particular, since these firms are the most important actors in the generation, application and international transfer of technology, as well as the possible spillover effects of foreign investment were totally ignored. Evidence from the Mexican manufacturing industry showed, however, that foreign investment could give rise to indirect gains or spillovers, you will find, to the most economy through the realization of external economies, okay, through the works of Blomstrom and Person. Okay. We will also discuss how capitalist development at the periphery is not viable, how dependent capitalism is based on extensive exploitation of labor and is tied to the necessity of underpaying labor. Local bourgeois no longer exist as an active social force. The penetration of multinational firms leads local states to pursue an expansionist policy, typically sub-imperialist, and the periphery's only alternatives are socialism or fascism, or there is some other model of development, or there is no model of development. And then we will discuss the context of Asia, I mean the idea of dependence in an Asian context through the drain theory of Dadabhai Naoroji, Gandhi, M.N. Roy and Indian Marxism, the attitude towards dependency theory, the Indian mode of production debate, self-reliance versus modernization in China, for example, the Maoist approach towards modernization, the capitalist heavens of Asia, the prototypes, the emulators and so on. Okay, this is what we are going to discuss in the next lecture, as then we will give a closer to the critics of dependency theory, and then we will move on to the limits to growth thesis 1, 2, then we will discuss I mean limits to growth thesis, when I say I mean Meadows and his colleagues works on limits to growth argument, limits to growth thesis, and then we will discuss Small is Beautiful by Ernst Friedrich Schumacher, F. Schumacher. Then we will discuss Toward a History of Needs by Ivan Illich, and then we will end with Franz J. Schurman's Paradigms Lost, Paradigms Regained. And then for the time being, in the next lecture we are going to complete the critiques of dependency theory as well as the dependency theory through the lenses of Asia in general and India in particular. Thank you.